Did you sexually assault a woman in Monterey, California?
I have, as far as the media is concerned, it's very simple. The matter was fully investigated, and I was completely clear, and that's where I'm leaving. Thank you very much.
Have you addressed concerns about your lack of
Sir, about the police report.
That was Fox News personality, Trump's pick for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. The allegations Hegseth is denying stem from an incident in 2017 where a woman alleges that Hegseth sexually assaulted her after a convention in Monterey Bay, California. Today, in response to a records request by the media, the Monterey Police Department released the police report about that incident. The report details the woman's allegations that after the conference, she went to an after party and then the hotel bar, both of which Hegseth also went to. At the bar, she believes some form of drug may have been slipped into her drink. She says she remembered walking out of the bar and ending up at the hotel pool where she claims to have had an argument with Hegseth. She says her next memory is being in Hegseth's hotel room, where she says Hegseth took her phone and physically blocked her from leaving his room. She remembers saying no a lot, and then she remembers a sexual encounter took place. The sexual encounter part of the report is a little too not safe for work for television, but just know that I am sparing you some details here. Hegseth denies any wrongdoing and frames this incident as consensual, pointing to the fact that he was not charged as evidence of his innocence. But the police and the local district attorney did not give a reason as to why they didn't charge him. Deciphering what is true here is made all the more complicated by the revelation, first reported in the Washington Post last week, that Hegseth paid an undisclosed amount to this accuser as part of a non-disclosure agreement. So the accuser is likely legally barred from speaking out. Now, it remains to be seen if those allegations will move the needle with Republicans in the Senate, the way the allegations against Matt Gaetz apparently did. This was how Republican Senator Roger Wicker, who is set to chair the Senate Armed Services Committee, this is how he spoke about Pete Hegseth's chances today.
What are your concerns about the nomination, and did he answer some of those concerns? Did you raise them?
I think he's going to be in pretty good shape.
Did you talk about the allegations in the police report, the sexual assault allegations?
We weren't specific, but, since no charges were brought by the authorities, we have only the press reports.
Should you have gotten into some of those specifics? Would that be a more fulsome adjudication of his nomination?
We'll be looking to have a fulsome...
It doesn't seem promising. But sexual assault allegations are not the only reason Pete Hegseth could give some Republicans pause. This week, NBC News reported that Trump's transition team is drawing up a list of current and former U.S. military officers they would like to court-martial. Reuters has reported on another list Trump's team is drawing up of all the Pentagon officers Trump wants to fire. And to top all of that off, Trump has been loudly doubling down on his threat to use the U.S. military to round up, detain, and deport millions of immigrants. That would mean using the U.S. military on U.S. soil, sending troops into American neighborhoods. Now, in the previous Trump administration, there was a belief, accurate or not, that some of the people around Trump curbed his most extreme impulses. There were adults in the room, if you will. And as much as Republicans in the Senate claim they are all aboard the MAGA train, many of them probably hope there are still some adults in the room at the end of the day. Republican Senator Rand Paul, for instance, came out yesterday to publicly oppose Trump's idea of using the U.S. military on U.S. soil for deportations. That appears to be a bridge too far for Senator Rand Paul. Again, it is a low bar, but it is a bar. And the moment for Congress to rein in Trump's worst instincts is right now. Pete Hegseth, if he is confirmed as Trump's Secretary of Defense, appears to be more than willing to go along with everything Trump is asking for and will treat anyone who stands in Trump's way as an enemy of the state. In addition to being a Fox News personality, Hegseth is also a prolific author. In the past 4 years, he has published 3 books, American Crusade, Battle for the American Mind, and The War on Warriors. Jonathan Chait at The Atlantic spent the past few weeks reading all those books. American Crusade calls for the categorical defeat of the left with the goal of utter annihilation, without which America cannot and will not survive. Hegseth writes, our American crusade is not about literal swords, and our fight is not with guns yet. In The War on Warriors, Hegseth makes clear that he views the American left as actual enemies of the United States. The expectation is that we will defend America against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. Not political opponents, but real enemies. Yes, Marxists are our enemies. And Hegseth reportedly does not mince words about how the U.S. military should treat those enemies. In The War on Warriors, Hegseth makes plain that he considers the very idea of rules of war just more woke nonsense. Our enemies should get bullets, not attorneys. Here's how Chait reflected on all of Hegseth's recent books as a whole. The main question I was looking to answer when I started reading Hegseth's collected works was whether he would follow a Trump command to shoot peaceful protesters. After having read them, I don't think he would even wait for the order. Joining me now is Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat of Connecticut, who sits on the Judiciary and Armed Services Committees. Senator, thank you so much. You have exactly the perspective and expertise we need right now. First, I got to ask, we've talked a lot about Matt Gaetz. We've talked about Tulsi Gabbard. Pete Hegseth has just a ton of controversy around him. I think the sexual assault allegation is one piece of it, but those writings about turning the United States against other American citizens with whom he disagrees seems just dramatically dangerous for someone who might be the defense secretary. What's your reaction?
Dramatically dangerous is exactly the right way to view it. These concerns are deadly serious. We're talking about Pam Bondi, who is another one of the Trump loyalists, apologists, sycophants who will do his bidding, just like Gaetz would have done. In the case of the Department of Justice, where prosecutions can be brought as retribution, at least you have the courts
as a stopgap,
as a buffer, as a firewall. In the case of the Department of Justice, if there are orders to troops,
the Department of Defense,
to shoot in case of a protest or a gathering in a church basement or any kind of meeting, there is no restraint of the same kind. And so what this kind of threat represents is something profoundly dangerous to our democracy. And that's why I have actually proposed a measure that would constrain the Insurrection Act, which is the legal basis for the president to order this kind of military intervention on American soil. And remember, we use the military to defend our nation. We do not use it against our own citizens on American soil. And that's the basis of our constitutional principle and also the Insurrection Act. Unfortunately, the Insurrection Act is so broad that he could misinterpret it.
Do you think Senate Republicans share your trepidation? Do you think you'll have some bipartisan support for that measure?
I think my Republican colleagues are very sympathetic to it because it's not just about Donald Trump. It's a weakness in our present law. They could be misused by an independent or a Democrat in that same office. We ought to move to correct it. But right now, we can see the fire on the horizon, and we ought to do something about it because I think our Republican colleagues ultimately will be judged harshly by history if we fail to do so. And so I think this concern about the misuse of the military also deeply concerns our military.
Yeah, of course. There's also the issue of, what Hegseth, as the Secretary of Defense, might do to the actual military itself. I want to play a little bit of audio. This is from earlier this month. This is Pete Hegseth on a podcast talking about what he wants to do if he's in charge of the military. Let's take a listen.
Well, first of all, you got to fire. You got to fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and you got to fire this. Obviously, you're going to bring in a new Secretary of Defense, but any general that was involved, general, admiral, whatever that was involved in any of the DEI woke, it's got to go. Either you're in for war fighting, and that's it, and that's the only litmus test we care about. You got to get DEI and CRT out of military academies, so you're not training young officers to be baptized in this type of thinking. And then, whatever the standards, whatever the combat standards were, say, in, 1995, let's just make those the standards. And as far as recruiting, to hire the guy that, did Top Gun Maverick and create some real ads that motivate people to want to serve.
Top Gun Maverick, and throw away the combat standards, rewind time to like 30 years ago when warriors could be real warriors. That raises like alarm bells for me. I don't know how you hear that, and whether you think that there's a real possibility that someone like Hegseth, as defense secretary, could turn America's fighting forces into like an army of MAGA warriors.
Even more important than alarm bells for me are alarm bells for our military, because we need professional warfighters. We need people like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chairman Brown, who is a professional officer of the Air Force, a general who knows how to do a military budget, who knows how to hire and promote and recruit and retain the best fighters in the world, which is what our national defense requires. And he knows how to keep secrets.
Yes.
Which, unfortunately, people like Hegseth do not know how to do. And I want to mention one other point that I think is really important on sexual assault. Chairman Brown, Chairman Milley before him, their predecessors, our military have focused on trying to stop sexual assault in the military.
Yes.
I've worked with Senator Gillibrand for the last 15 years. It is still a scourge to have someone leading the military who himself is potentially guilty of sexual assault is such a violation of public trust. And when he says he was cleared, no, he was not cleared. They stopped the investigation. We don't know why. And we need to get to the bottom of why the investigation, in fact, was stopped in the Armed Services Committee before we confirm him.
You think you will?
We're going to look for those files. I think we need them. We deserve them before we make judgments. And I would challenge Roger Wicker, as he got into that elevator,
We're looking for a fulsome...
to do a fulsome investigation and tell the American people what we found. They deserve the truth. It should not be classified. It should not be confidential. The American people deserve to know the truth.